of you know Jeff, but we have people here for the very first time, so I do want to introduce Jeff. He is an Israeli anthropologist. He's taught at many universities. He's a professor of anthropology, the director of the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions, ICAHD. So we're the ones supporting him here. Jeff is the author of several books, and two of his titles are here: War Against the People, Israel, the Palestinians and Global Pacification, and Decolonizing Israel, Liberating Palestine, Zionism, Settler Colonialism, and the Case for One Democratic State. You know, something that not everybody knows is that in August 2008, Jeff was invited to be part of the first boat, the boats that sailed into Gaza to break the siege, and it was successful. Jeff got in there. He spent 3 days speaking Hebrew to the Palestinians in Gaza who wanted to practice their Hebrew, and when he went out, he was arrested. That is a whole story. Jeff was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize by the Quakers, the American Friends Service Committee in America, along with Palestinian Ghassan Andoni. And Jeff, all of his life, has reached out to situations of injustice, going back to the civil rights movement in America. And when he went to Israel, it was to really work on creating this egalitarian society. You can read about Jeff's journey in previous books and articles. You know, Jeff, he's coming with so much to say. Let's get straight to the point, okay? And over to you. So, Jeff Halper, welcome.
Okay. Thank you very much. I'm always glad to be in a crowd of people where I'm the youngest one. So, before I start, I do want to acknowledge the genocide in Gaza and spreading into the West Bank and potentially spreading into Lebanon as well, and maybe into wider regions of the Middle East. We have to acknowledge that. Our hearts are with all the peoples that are the victims of these Israeli military attacks, of course. And I say that also because, you know, today the purpose of this conference is political. As Linda said, ICAHD has always been a political organization. We began ICAHD itself in 1997, back in Israel-Palestine, you know, focusing on house demolitions. You know, that was our focus, but using house demolitions as the vehicle for giving people an understanding of why houses are being demolished. And, you know, what's the purpose behind it? And how does it impact in terms of Israel's widening takeover of the occupied territory? And, of course, the human suffering involved in demolitions. So the demolitions was, in a sense, a window into why Israel is doing this and to what purpose. So our intent has always been political. So today what I'd like to do, so I'm saying, you know, the acknowledgement is important because it's very emotional, you know, obviously, but political analysis is cold and it's analytical, and so, you know, I don't want to appear as if I'm ignoring or minimizing what's happening. But at the same time, we have to multitask. Even though these crimes, these tragedies, this genocide is occurring, nonetheless, the political world continues on. The United States and Israel are still pushing, as I'll mention in a second, this normalization process. There are all kinds of plans for reshaping the Middle East, for erasing the Palestinian presence, And so at the same time that we're focused on, properly so, Gaza and the West Bank and Lebanon and so on, we nevertheless have to also keep our eye on the political situation. So today I'd like to just speak quickly because, so ICAHD as a political organization is always focused on the big picture. That's what we've been trying to do all these years, to take what's happening on the ground, what Israel is doing, Palestinian aspirations, Palestinian resistance, all the particular events that occur, and put it into a bigger picture to help people understand in a critical, anti-Zionist way, as an anti-Zionist Israeli, in a critical way, what's going on, but always with the intent of how do we resolve this? So that ICAHD has always been active in terms of a political solution or a political program in order to move this ahead, because resistance is not enough, protest is not enough, campaigning is not enough. There has to be a political program. And for that reason, ICAHD has also joined, and Livnatu, you'll hear later, is also a member of our group, a Palestinian-led organization called the One Democratic State Campaign. And together we formulated a 10-point political program that I'll relate to in a second. So that, I think, is the value added of what ICAHD is trying to provide. Hopefully, like Linda says, with this conference, you'll not only get the big picture and a more critical understanding of what's happening, but also where is this whole apartheid colonial project going on the one hand, but where should we be going as a political resistance movement to that as well? So I want to do three things today in the little time I have. One is to actually talk about where are we headed in terms of where Israel thinks it's headed, or where we're headed politically. Not where we should be headed, but where the whole situation is headed. And secondly, to mention our One Democratic State program, where we should be headed politically from our point of view. And now also I want to relate to, we're in a situation today where these events are happening, but we're not at the point where we do have a political program. The Palestinians have to still come together behind it, which is very difficult for them, as we'll hear. It isn't ready to be put out yet. So we're sort of in what I call in the meantime. How do we push the Palestinian issue ahead? How do we protect Palestinians? How do we further the political process and do our lobbying and our campaigning, even though we don't yet have that end game that we need in order to make those demands in our governments? So, in terms of where we're headed politically, if Simon lets me do the remote, is it
stuck?
Okay. So where we're headed politically, we can just take listen to the ultimate authority, in a sense. Netanyahu, on September 22nd, 2023, 2 weeks before October 7th, got up in the UN with his map, that many of you know, of course, and really set out exactly where Israel, the United States, and its collaborators in the Middle East, like Saudi Arabia, for example, are going politically. And that is towards normalization. Now that's an interesting word, and I'll come back to it, because settler colonialism, and I'm going to talk about that in length, because that's really what we have to be talking about. Zionism as settler colonialism ends through normalization. When it becomes normalized, where this country is called Israel, and there are no more issues, and the Palestinians disappear, and we have normal relations with the Arab world, and we're a member of the UN as Israel, and we take a normal place in the international community. That's how settler colonialism ends. And it's very interesting that Biden has taken, I don't think Biden's ever read a book on settler colonialism, but he takes that same language because it's the same logic. And the process that the United States is pushing before October 7th and where it's desperate to get back to is normalization. You know, the idea that to complete, in a sense, the Abrahamic Accords, so-called, that Trump began during his term of office, in which the jewel in the crown, of course, is Saudi Arabia. And once Saudi Arabia falls into place, and you have this major sector of the Sunni Muslim world normalizing relations with Israel, then, of course, the whole situation can be normalized internationally. The conflict, if you want, is over from that point of view. And as you can see from the map, the Palestinians disappear. And this is the point of it. In other words, what do we mean by normalization? We mean a greater Israel between the river and the sea. From the Mediterranean to the Jordan River, a greater Israel, because in all the discussion of normalization, and you can look it up on the internet and go back, it's been a few years now that they've talked about normalization, going back to the Trump time and the Abrahamic Accords, there has never, ever, ever been a hint that Israel would have to give up its settlement project in the West Bank and East Jerusalem and give up its control of Gaza as a part of the normalization process. Normalization has always been de facto, implicitly defined as a greater Israel, right? Normalizing with the Arab world, normalizing with the international community. So that you'll have an Israel that extends from Mediterranean to the Jordan River, as this map clearly shows, normalizing. And that means then that, where are the Palestinians? Well, Israel's stuck with the Palestinians so far, unless it can ethnically cleanse them, which I won't get into that now, which it wants to do in Gaza, certainly. So that you have apartheid. That has to be, with genocide, unless you can wipe out the native population or drive them out of the country, and half the Palestinians have been driven out of Palestine since 1948, it has to be apartheid. So that what we're looking at, and I'll mention that in a second, is an apartheid situation in which the Palestinians are locked into a small Bantustan. We'll call that a state. Right? It'll have a president. The Palestinian Bantustan today has a president, Abu Mazen, and a parliament that never meets, and that's good enough. In other words, what I think the powers that be, the United States, NATO, Europe, expect is that people aren't going to read the fine print. In other words, once we have a two-state solution, even though Israel is on 90% of Palestine, and the Palestinians are locked into such small little islands, you don't even see them on the map, that's good enough. That's a two-state solution. You'll have a Palestinian collaborationist president that says, yes, that's fine, and then you can go on with normalization. So this is the situation that's emerging because the United States and Saudi Arabia are desperate to get back to the normalization situation. And this is the urgency. Because if, let's say, maybe, with the death of Sinwar, maybe there will be some kind of a ceasefire in November, Biden has said once the fighting dies down in Gaza, we're going to go back to this normalization process, which could mean January, February, March, or whatever. Normalization, the United States believes, and Israel believes, is the end of everything. In other words, settler colonialism has an end. So there's a kind of a deadline in front of us here. We're not talking about some open-ended process, and we can take our time in terms of developing a political program and a strategy and meeting and so on. You know, these events go on, and they have a timetable, and they have a process, and they have power behind them. And so that's the challenge facing us today, is normalization. Now, it's very hard. It's great when 300,000 people meet in the streets of London. I mean, really, generally it's great. But it's very hard to mobilize people around a concept like normalization. Genocide, yes. Apartheid, yes. Maybe occupation, yes. Normalization, but that is exactly the name of the challenge, the immediate challenge we're facing today. Because if this normalization process goes through, our task is going to be so much more difficult because the Palestinian issue will tend to disappear. And it doesn't leave much space beyond that. So, okay, Simon, it's still not working. Do you have to do it or what? Let's try. Okay.
No, wrong direction.
Okay. Can we erase my picture in the screen, or that has to be there? Great. All right, thanks. I don't have much time, so I'm not going to get into a whole discussion of settler colonialism, but we all know the term settler colonialism. You know, there's a lot of academic terms that stay in academia. This term somehow escaped, and you have actually a lot of the slideshow on. What's your name again? I forgot.
David.
Miles. The David, I didn't know who was going to do it, but it's a great service. David sort of provided a lot of the slideshow. I don't know how he got it in a guerrilla way, but he got it.
No, I sent it.
So you'll have this, just to mention that. You know, so settler colonialism is a word we use all the time. But it's an academic term, and we don't always know what it means. We use it as kind of an accusation. Zionism is settler colonialism. All right, we've said that, and now we go on to but it's a super important term, because we always use the more common term that we also use that contradicts it is conflict. We're always talking about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Palestinians talk about the conflict. You know, the media talks, that's the term we use. Well, conflict and settler colonialism are two completely different and diametrically opposed things. And so it's really important that we begin to adopt an anti-colonial language, because we're not in a conflict. A conflict is between two sides, right? Well, two or more sides. Well, if you grant Zionism, the settler colonial project, the status of a side, you've elevated what really is an illegal, immoral, illegitimate colonization project into a legitimate side in a conflict. You see? So, and at the same time, what you've done is you force the indigenous population, the Palestinians, to be a side. They're not a side. They're the indigenous population. They have all the rights in the world to their country. Once you make them a side, all right, now we're in a conflict, right? How do you resolve a conflict? You negotiate. You compromise. Well, now we're forcing the indigenous populations to compromise over rights they shouldn't have to be negotiating. What does it mean? What are we forcing them to negotiate? That Palestine is their homeland? What do we want them to compromise? That 78% of their homeland becomes now a Jewish state? We want them to haggle in terms of how many refugees can come back. There's 6 million refugees. Well, you know, maybe Israel will allow 10,000 to come back. Well, let's haggle and see if we can get 20,000, 30. We're forcing the Palestinians to negotiate and compromise on issues that they absolutely shouldn't even be discussing. So conflict is a bad term. It elevates and legitimizes the Israeli Zionist project on the one hand, and at the same time it degrades the Palestinian struggle for liberation, and in the end it prevents Palestinians from having any kind of historical justice, because compromise is the basis of conflict resolution. And of course, Israel is a strong party, backed by the global north. And so it's an impossible situation for Palestinians. Settler colonialism changes that idea, because in settler colonialism, it's clear that the indigenous population is it's unilateral. It's unilateral. The settlers, the Zionists, came into Palestine with an agenda of taking it over. They took it over by force. They've denied Palestinians their rights. They've driven most of the Palestinians out of the country. They want to drive the rest out or confine them to apartheid regime. Everything, the whole Zionist project and Israel are illegitimate and have to be ended, actually. So that is what the term settler colonialism means, and it gives them all the rights of the indigenous population to reclaim their rights to the country. So, and I don't have time now, I was going to do this more, but so in other words, it's important for us to understand what settler colonialism is and begin to use that language. So instead of conflict, what we should be talking about is an anti-colonial struggle against a settler colonial project. That's the name of what we should be, and our language should begin to reflect that. And there were 3 stages of this project. I won't get into it. The foundational stage, where the British, I don't know today why the British don't feel a sense of more shame or more responsibility. I mean, you guys know better than I do. The fact that in 2017 the British government was proud of the Balfour Declaration, the 100 years. So, at any rate, during the British time in particular, Zionism established itself, and the point I guess I want to make after each stage, and this is the point, is that it always ends with normalization and legitimization. Again, that's how it succeeds. That's how it wins. So at the end of this stage, by 1947, it had the Balfour Declaration, right? It had the Balfour Declaration dictated to Balfour by Chaim Weizmann, who was the head of the Zionist community here in Britain. The Balfour Declaration then taken word for word into the League of Nations mandate, in which there are no Palestinians, there are no Arabs mentioned. In the League of Nations mandate, you only talk about existing non-Jewish communities. That's the term that's used. And then, of course, the partition plan of 1947, that gave the Jews, who were newcomers to the country, 56% of Palestine, with no authority. The UN had no authority to do that. But that was the legitimization that the Zionist project enjoyed. In the second stage, Simon, why don't you just hit the button? In the second stage, no, all right. In the second stage, it's the same kind of a thing. 1948 to 1967, you can see here, and I think David has maybe the slide in this booklet, you can see the whole process of how now the ethnic cleansing, the state violence, the warfare, the genocide. The genocide, and we said this in an ICAHD statement right after October 7th. Genocide did not begin on October 7th. The genocide began actually in 1947 and especially in 1948 when the British left, and then the Zionists had a free rein to do what they wanted to do. They were constrained in all the years that during the mandate years. And then you had the ethnic cleansing, the conquest of 78% of Palestine, the Judaization. Now you see, that's a term we don't use very often, Judaization. But that's an anti-colonial term. It's not a term we use often, but this is exactly what settler colonialism, Zionist settler colonialism, set out to do, to Judaize Palestine, to turn an Arab country into a Jewish country, to transform Palestine into Israel. And you have the systematic Judaization, and then again, the end of stage 2, which is 1967, normalization. Because what you have already in 1948 and 49 is the acceptance of Israel as a member state of the UN. So this whole settler enterprise is now legitimized and normalized, and Israel is a normal country of the United Nations. And finally, stage 3 is from 1967 until today, in which Israel is completing its process of Judaization. The settlements, the establishment of what I call a matrix of control over the West Bank and Gaza, and finally leading to the apartheid that we mentioned. And here I'll just say, in terms of where we're going, where we're headed, the map that we had done years ago, ICAHD has talked about apartheid for years. We assumed the outlines were fairly clear. You'd have in Israel an 85% of Palestine, including the borders, right? And areas A and B and Gaza were the Palestinian Bantustan on the other 15%. It was pretty clear, and in fact, the wall that went around A, B, and Gaza kind of defined that in concrete. Well, it's turned out now with Bezalel Smotrich, this crazy settler who's the Minister of Finance, but he's also the head of the civil administration, the Israeli military government of the West Bank, is in the process now of nullifying the Palestinian Authority's authority to grant building permits, and its authority on the municipal level, and its authority over land, which means then that Area B, which is 22% of the West Bank, I mean, this is almost a quarter of the West Bank, will now be open for Israeli settlement, land expropriation, and the demolition of Palestinian homes. So now we're talking about, as you can see from these 4 little dots, we're talking about an apartheid regime in which the Palestinian Bantustan is reduced to 10% of Palestine, and of course in truncated, disconnected islands. So that's why in Netanyahu's map you don't even see these dots. But this is the 2-state solution, and we should be talking about 2-state apartheid. All right. Now, genocide. All right, I have another.
Oh, okay.
Okay. So genocide is built into settler colonialism. I mean, you can't take over somebody else's country and take their land and displace them and erase them as a cultural, historical people, presence in the country without genocide. I mean, it could be cultural genocide, but mixed, certainly today, we can see it, with physical genocide. That's built into the settler colonial process, and that's why it's so important in our reframing. I'm talking about reframing from a conflict to an anti-colonial discourse, why it's so important that we adopt more colonial terms. For example, state terrorism. Terrorism is a colonial term. Terrorism is a term that all colonial regimes use against resistance because they don't legitimize the resistance of the indigenous population. And we have to talk about resistance, and then we have to talk about state terrorism. because we never talk about state terrorism, because states are seen to have the legitimate monopoly over the use of force. I was going to talk about Gaza, but I don't have time. But I do, well, okay, this is something you can't really read. When Sinwar was killed the other day, which is a major event in all kinds of ways, I was trying to think, how do we, and people were having trouble dealing with it. How do we talk about Sinwar? How do we talk about Hamas? How do we talk about the Hamas attacks, the Hamas campaigns? How do we talk about Israel? I mean, all this is because we're trying to formulate ideas within this framework of a conflict, and it doesn't work, because that's not, resistance is not, and the rights, what Hamas is even trying to do, whether you agree with the Hamas program or not, has nothing to do with a conflict. It has to do with the assertion of the rights of the indigenous, to their homeland. So then, how do we deal with the death of Sinwar? And I tried to put it within, again, this framework of state terror in the service of colonialism that emphasizes the terror and the violence and the taking over of Palestine and the use of power against Palestinians versus indigenous non-state resistance. And then if you look at Sinwar and Hamas and so on, in the framework of resistance, it takes on a whole different meaning, and you're able to talk about it in a non-defensive sort of a way. Whether you agree with the program or not, that doesn't really matter. The point is, it's a part of the resistance movement, so that, and of course, that also gets into the issue of terrorism that I've written about as well, because what's called terrorism, we shouldn't even use that word, but what's called terrorism is the response of oppressed peoples when they have no other redress. And the Palestinians have tried, as we all know, they've tried negotiations. They've tried appeals to international law. International law absolutely supports the Palestinian struggle. But of course, even though there's some good decisions of the ICJ, and we'll see about the ICC and so on, there's no enforcement mechanisms. And so the states have a monopoly over the use of terror on the one hand, but we're able to demonize resistance groups of oppressed peoples using that same term, terror. I don't have time to get into that, but all right, let's move just in a minute to the second part about the political, how we see, where we're headed from our point of view, the point of view of our Palestinian partners in the One Democratic State campaign and elsewhere, plus anti-Zionist Israelis like myself. So settler colonialism, again, can win. This is in a sense, this is what we're facing. Is it going to win? The Judaization of Palestine has been largely completed. Israel is in a mopping up process now. That's why you see this rise of ethnic cleansing in Area C of the West Bank, why you have these military attacks in the Tulkarm and Jenin refugee camps. This is an anticipation of the renewal of the normalization process that's going to happen in the next few months. And then it wins with normalization and apartheid. That's the plan. That's where we're headed, if we means Biden, Israel, and Saudi Arabia. So where we're headed, in terms of us, the people that are here, in support of the Palestinians, is to say settler colonialism can be defeated. It has been defeated many times in the world. But that means you've got to summon power. And where we are today is there's always been a strong Palestinian resistance, although Israel is in the process of trying to finally dismantle the last vestiges of resistance. But it's not enough. You have to have a political program. And there I go back to where I started saying that we don't have a political program yet. We've got the one democratic state idea, which is the only way forward. We have a detailed program, but for all kinds of reasons I'm not going to get into, we're not at the end of that process of actually a critical mass of Palestinians coming together behind it. Without a political program, we're paralyzed. We're paralyzed. And that's our problem. That's the problem of us, the Palestinians in Palestine, and their anti-Zionist Israeli supporters, is that we've got to get past our paralysis and really move towards inserting a political program, because without that, you cannot summon, we can't mobilize all of you. You're mobilized, but all you have is BDS and campaigns and different things that are important, but you're not able to take that final step and demand of your government, this is the political solution that we're advocating for. And that's our responsibility to provide that, and then we can mobilize you. So if we summon power in those ways towards one democratic state, I really do believe we can defeat. I mean, governments governments support Israel for all kinds of reasons, of course. I wrote about that in my book, War Against the People. But the peoples of the world are clearly supporting the Palestinian people. So if we can replicate what the ANC did in South Africa, and that is bypass governments and go to the peoples and the churches and the trade unions and the students and all of you, the public, with a clear political program and goal, we can defeat. I really do believe we can cause the collapse of the Israeli apartheid regime and then the rise in that ruin of something, of one democratic state for everyone.
Okay.
All right, and finally, where's the thing about 5 minutes, 1 minute, 2 minutes?
It's been showing.
Oh, I'm sorry. All right. I'm sorry. Let me just put up one more slide. I won't talk about it. If Simon, okay. There's a whole thing. I was going to talk about one democratic state. My last point is, all right, what can we do in the meantime? In the meantime, until this political program comes about that you can mobilize behind, and keep doing what you're doing. That's really important. Develop and use this anti-colonial framing, so we're much better at advocating for, articulating the colonial position of the Palestinians and the logic of their struggle, and then a whole bunch of stop campaigns. Stop arming Israel, stop apartheid, stop normalization, and then some more practical things, especially strengthening cooperation between you and Palestinians in Palestine. Because there is a disconnect. A lot of Palestinians like Atta, for example, are not connected to what's happening here. Don't really know about the outpouring so much. Atta may be more than the average Palestinian, but I think there's a feeling of isolation in Palestine, certainly a feeling of fear, and I think reaching out to a wider circle of Palestinian leaders, young leaders, activists on the ground would really strengthen their movement and strengthen your ability to work with Palestinians in terms of your own strategies. So I'm sorry I ran over time. I didn't see the big stop sign in front of me.
Okay. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you. Thank you.